Welcome, Mitchell and Emily Clionsky, the authors of Dementia Prevention, Using Your Head to Save Your Brain. What a great title of the book. I want to welcome you to This is 50, Freedom Through Passions. And I'm really just going to start to just dig right in. We met just before Christmas. Then we took a little Christmas break, and then we ended up, you're now going to be my very first podcast recording for the new year. So how were your holidays? What did you guys do? Tell us a little bit about where you guys are. What did you did over the holidays?
Well, we're in Massachusetts, but first of all, Happy New Year. Thanks for having
Happy
us.
New Year.
It's great to be
My
with you.
pleasure. I can't wait to
Um,
get into this story.
right, we had a great holiday. Grandchildren were here. We had a good time seeing Mitch's son build a fire truck that his son could ride on
Okay.
that we gifted him, and
Okay.
a great big, huge 4-foot teddy bear. So it was lovely. It was a lovely family
Nice.
time.
Was.
Nice. Awesome.
Most people, they just hang out for that way. We actually close our offices before Christmas and we open again after the New Year. So for most people, that's a time for kicking back. For us, every year we look at, okay, what can we do to launch the new year in some creative way or some scientific way? A couple of years ago is when we started our book over a Christmas break, and really a couple of years after that, put the final touches to it again over a Christmas break. So, as they say, there's no rest for the wicked. We're always doing something. This year, what we're looking at is 2024. How do we want to take dementia prevention
Amazing.
and take it from being more than a book into something of a cause, something of a movement? Because it's so much larger than just some book that a couple specialists have written with information that's scientifically based and self analysis and action steps. We really want to get this information into the hands of people who can have a larger footprint, larger outreach. So we're very actively looking at starting a foundation with the
Love it.
goal of putting this information, probably through our book, into the hands of every medical student and every master's and doctoral level psychologist, the nurse practitioners in training, the physician's assistants in training, because they're the people who can really motivate all of the people who they work with, who they care for, and they can ask the right kinds of questions during their examinations. They
Mhm.
can do short, brief, but accurate tests in their office to identify early on who's beginning to slip. And they're the people
Mhm.
who are now learning all about evidence based medicine. They're the people who are going to go out there and change the world of healthcare. So that's what we want to do, is find a way of impacting. It's a big ask because there's more than 100,000 of them out there. We may not be able to do it all in one bite. We may have to nibble at this. But that's our goal for 2024.
And that
So you're
actually comes from evidence-based information from the Alzheimer's Association that they did a survey in 2020 and found out that one of the barriers to getting patients diagnosed early and getting them treated appropriately is the fact that about 50% of newly graduated physicians who are now opening their practices in the first 1 or 2 years of practice feel that they have not been educated enough about dementia, don't know how to diagnose it, and don't know how to treat it. And when they do suspect its presence, they want to refer it to a specialist, and there aren't any. There aren't
Mhm.
really that many people who are competent to treat dementia in an all encompassing fashion.
One thing you said to me in our pre-call is that, your book says that the title says everything, prevention. And one thing we talked about was that, a lot of the times it's not, it's treated after it's been diagnosed. And I think this is what this foundation, from what I can tell, I did not know about this foundation for everybody listening. And so it's to bring the earlier awareness and so that you can prevent. And just real quickly, I did do a little poll on my Instagram, and one of the questions about, like, I had mentioned that I'm going to be interviewing you, and what questions do people have around dementia? And one question was, what are the early signs and what really is prevention? And I think, like, that's such a great question. Like, what are the signs? I know, and even in your book, I forget the exact stat, but you said something like the ages between 18 and 24 are really worried. Oh, maybe I've got that stat wrong. Oh, so that over 40% of 18 to 24 year olds think there's no way of escaping dementia.
Mhm. Yeah, the question of symptoms and signs is such a tricky question. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, anxiety can produce many of the same early signs. And so when you have someone who's really focused on, oh my goodness, I can't remember where I left my coffee cup, or
Hmm.
I went to introduce my friend to someone else and momentarily could not recall their name. I must be losing it. Or we go into a room and say, why did I come in here? And you have to retrace, oh, yeah, that's right. I'm going to do this. So those can be completely normal phenomena, especially if you're anxious or you got a lot going on, or you're thinking about something you're going to do later on that day and you're doing this automatically. So we don't focus quite as much on trying to identify signs. There was this little instrument that came out some years ago called the AD8. They were 8 symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So the AD8 had these 8 symptoms. And as we looked at them, we realized this is not going to be helpful because everyone has some of these some of the time.
Hmm.
Instead, we wanted to go about this differently. Rather than asking what symptoms you have, since it oftentimes early on it's almost like an invisible or silent disease like high blood pressure,
Hmm.
we want to have a brief test that can be given by a doctor, healthcare professional during annual visits. That'll take 5 minutes to give and will give us a marker that's objective. Sort of like instead of asking someone, how's your weight? Why don't we put them on a scale?
Hmm.
That way we
Yeah.
know what their weight truly is, and we can look at their body composition, decide if they're underweight, overweight, or right in the middle. So that's our approach to this is not so much signs and symptoms because they're misleading. And
Hmm.
oftentimes people who have the worst problems don't even recognize that they have those problems. They will deny it. No, 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 that's not me. So let's go toward brief testing. It can only take 5 minutes. We actually developed a test that does this accurately in 5 minutes. It's been published in 4 different journals. It's been used by a number of different doctors. So that's the way we think is the entry point into this problem.
Is
There's
that,
another
sorry,
thing
Emily.
that's involved in that, and that is that not all dementias act the same way. They're
Mhm.
not all the same disease. They don't affect the brain or the parts of the brain or how the brain is working the same way. So it's not fair to think that all dementias are going to cause someone to have a short term memory loss or, oh, I just can't remember the 3 things I needed in the grocery store. Some people may have no problems with their memory whatsoever, but not be able to coordinate multitasking multiple things at the same time the same way they used to. Their
Hmm.
judgment may be impaired. They may realize that they can't read and understand a book, a novel,
Hmm.
the way they used to. So there's different ways that the signs and symptoms of early disease could appear.
Hmm.
So it's not easy to say this is what you should all look for.
So essentially, are you saying that, try to baseline yourself through this survey, this 5 minute assessment, and, kind of be sort of following along over, maybe do the survey, maybe redo the survey every 6 months and kind of baseline the next 6 months and the next 6 months or something like that.
Actually, we're going to be coming out with a version of the same test that's used by doctors that you could give to a loved one. So you have a mom,
Oh,
dad, a
amazing.
sibling, a spouse that you're concerned about. We want to package this in a way that you can give at home and be able to come up with an answer that you can then take into the doctor's office and say, hey, I'm concerned and here's why. And the doctor can look at this and say, well, let me do a test of my own, or let me refer you out, get some brain scan, some blood tests, the things that you would start looking at to try to
Hmm.
pick up on this earlier in the process.
Right, right. Okay, so I want to back up a little bit because we dove real deep, and I said we weren't going to do that right at the beginning. We did anyway, so it was my fault. Sorry about that. That's
But
the
it's
beauty of
so
an
much fun.
unscripted.
We're happy to go wherever you want to go with that.
The beauty of an unscripted podcast. Sometimes it's good, sometimes well, I think it's good. I don't know. Okay, so first of all, as everybody probably recognized, you are carrying the same last name. So two doctors. I know the story, but I want you to share the story because it's such a good story. I love it. You are obviously married, but you haven't always been together for the 50, 60 years or whatever or 30 years. Maybe I'm aging you there too much. Sorry about that. The 30 years, um, but yeah, actually, because I think to myself, God, if I was still married, I'd probably be married for 35, 40 years by now. Okay, so I digress. But yeah, let's get into how did you two meet? Because ultimately, I want to know why this book.
Wow. And from the pre-call, that's a bit of a long story, but we're going to try and keep it
Let's
short
try
and
it.
sweet. So
Let's
I'm going to
try
ask
it.
Mitch to start off.
You'll notice, did you see that? You notice that little shift?
I
I
saw
just
how
wanted
that
to,
worked. She's a smart cookie. I already got that in the pre-call.
tell people it's so hard to find a psychiatrist. I had to marry one.
Perfect.
So, so here's the story. I'll try to make it as brief and hopefully as interesting as possible because it was pretty interesting. Uh, as my father used to say, when I would go out with riding around with him, he'd see all these different people that recognized him. I'd say, Dad, how do you know that person? And he told me the same joke every time, which was, we went to two different schools together. Reality is, Emily and I went to two different schools together. We met one day, we were both into public speaking, into forensics. I was doing persuasive speech, still trying to persuade people. She was doing informative speech, to this day, interested in informing. I walked into the place where you sign your name to sign up for your events. This young brown haired girl sitting at the table looks up at me with these gorgeous eyes, and I was gone. I was
I love it.
absolutely in love at that moment. And she must have spoken with me because I'm not sure I would have been able to speak to her, but I don't remember the early part of the story because the latter part sort of take over. And we ended up dating, and we ended up uh, basically being together, having a dating relationship that was very warm and very, they talk about dogs, and there's a duck that follows the dog. It imprints on the dog. It thinks it's a dog. Well, turns out that at that age, you imprint on each other because there's a lot of
Mhm.
hormones going on. So I was 17, she was 15 and a half. We imprinted on each other until our parents broke us up because of apparent religious differences. So we didn't see each other then for a couple more years till we were both out of the house in college. We saw each other for a couple weekends in a row. And I made a horrible mistake and misunderstood something. And basically, we didn't see each other again until one day I got an email out of the blue. Now, we're talking 37
37 years
years later.
later.
Yeah.
And I get this email that says, I don't know if you remember me. Internally, my dialogue is, I don't think there's about 2 weeks or a month that's gone by over these years that I haven't remembered you. And from there, we started an
Amazing.
email. Now, at this point, our lives have gone completely separate directions in many ways. We were both in relationships and marriages. There was a whole different, this was about as far apart as you might expect. And we ended up seeing each other again about 6 months after that. And about a year after that, we got together to live together and have been there ever since. And this was
Amazing.
2006 that we started living together. And so it's been 17 years. And absolutely no regrets.
Best
Absolutely.
thing I
And
ever did in my life.
exactly. Best email you ever sent in your life, did you say?
That best thing I've ever done in my life.
But I like
Yeah,
your story better. Best email you ever sent.
Oh, best email I ever sent,
Talk about
yes.
getting results from an email.
Oh, yeah. I'm
exactly. Talk about that.
on that one. You can track down anybody, as you know.
Amazing. And that's I wanted you guys to tell that story because I kind of reminds me of like a movie, a little love story. So it's awesome. So Emily, tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll get into Mitchell's as well. Before we get into how you guys came together and figured out that this is probably a book that we should be uh, making and designing and publishing.
Well, I'll skip the really boring early years. Um, really and truly. I will tell you, I'm going to be 72 in March. So there's a lot of boring years in here.
You look amazing, woman.
Um, but I was really and truly, I managed to get a full scholarship to college in 1969 when I just turned 17 years old and promptly flunked out after 1 year.
hmm
Then went out and worked and went back to college a couple of years later and then decided to get married 3 weeks before graduation and never completed that degree. So I really didn't decide to become a doctor until I was in my early 40s.
That's such
I
an
had a very
amazing.
successful career selling computers. Initially, it was hardware and then software. I've sold artificial intelligence software based systems. So high speed transaction processing equipment, really high end computers, not laptops. So I was making a lot of money and having a perfectly lovely life. And one night, I was driving my Porsche with my girlfriend home from dinner and had a head on car wreck with the Porsche.
Mhm.
And apparently, I had a concussion because the next morning, when I went to sit up and get out of bed, I literally fell right back down again. Like,
Mhm.
a week later, I decided to become a doctor and take care of poor people, which
Wow.
was really funny because I didn't even have a degree. I knew I needed to go back to college. I knew I was going to have to go to medical school. I had no clue how intense that was going to really be. But I
Mhm.
went back to the same college that I started at, which was Carlow, now University, was Carlow College in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And the head of the biology department sat me down and said, Emily, do you know what this is going to take? And I said, well, I kind of
Mhm.
do. He said, okay, well, I'll give you 24 credits to do this semester. Meanwhile, I hadn't been in school for 20 years.
Wow.
And he figured he was going to get me to flunk out. I was either going to sink or swim.
He was
And
he was trying to, he was testing you?
I, they were giving me a challenge. They were
Wow.
really giving me a challenge.
Hmm.
Um, and the good news is that at the end of that year, I actually had done 60 credits at 3 different colleges and went to school 7 days a week for one solid year and took
Amazing.
my entrance exams to med school, did an early decision application to Jefferson in Philadelphia, and got accepted. So I started my
Congratulations. That is called moxie.
thank you. It was a guts ball move. And apparently I had always wanted to be a doctor and really wasn't aware of it until I was on vacation one time and I told people I was working with that that's what I wanted to do. And after I announced I was gotten accepted to medical school and told them, they said, "Well, of course you did. You told us
Right.
that that's what you wanted to do," and I was completely unaware of it.
Okay, so you crash the Porsche, you have an epiphany, and you think to yourself, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go and take care of the poor, like literally the poor, or like, what do you mean by the poor?
I really did mean poor people, people who were
Okay,
financially, socially, emotionally, as socially and economically deprived, because that's the way I grew up. I grew up
right.
as a daughter of a single woman, and we got Medicaid or the equivalent of Medicaid in New Jersey. I knew what it was like to be very poor.
Right.
And I knew what it was like for my mother to go to a hospital and have to be taken care of in a clinic and be thankful for that.
Hmm.
So,
And you ended up doing it actually.
and I actually ended
Yeah.
up doing that. When I graduated from medical school, to which I got a National Public Health Scholarship, thank you to the American taxpayer,
Hmm.
um, which is a scholarship given to people who want to become primary care doctors in this country. And I did a primary care residency in internal medicine and promptly went down to two of the poorest counties in North and South Carolina and stayed there for 4 years, taking care of people who were terribly underserved.
Hmm.
Women who had not had a doctor ask them to take their clothes off and put a patient gown on to be examined. And so we're walking to my office in 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 final stage ovarian cancer,
Wow.
lung cancers that had never been found, pancreatic cancers, people, and this was in one of the counties that had the highest amputation rates in diabetics in black patients. These patients' diabetes weren't being addressed, their blood pressure wasn't being addressed. So I really, I had some of the greatest patients in the world. I became a hospice and palliative care doctor while I was down there because there
Wow.
wasn't anybody else to do it. So my
Amazing.
commitment really is to people who are under cared for, underrepresented, and I still do that to a great deal in my practice today.
There's something to be admired about that story. 43 years old, had never really gone to college in the first place, did, but, dropped out, wasn't interested, however you want to put it.
Kicked out
Um,
once.
yeah, kicked out once. Excellent work. No, I love you even more every time you talk. No, it's like, yeah, like even that comment there, just like not trying not to live this sort of stereotypical life, but then finally coming to having that one event that makes you want to kind of do something. And it's such a common story amongst a lot of people, but particularly in my case, the women I talk to, who there's always been some sort of life event that has caused them to do something. And I think for you, going back to school at 43, that took a lot of moxie to do that, a lot of courage. You're going back to school at 43. Like, did everybody think you were the professor, or did they actually think you were the student, like,
No, they thought I was somebody's mother.
oh yeah.
They
Exactly.
thought I was somebody's mother in the class, and they just
Hmm.
wanted to know which of their other, classmates was my kid,
Right. Yeah, no, that's so
which was
funny,
pretty
so
funny.
funny.
I was the oldest person in my class.
So then Mitchell, what is your background? How did you go right into this type of doctor's stream, or what was your background?
At a much more traditional, but which is very typical. I mean, Emily's the one who jumps off cliffs and hopes she lands at the bottom okay. I'm the one who's going to go to the edge and look down and measure it and try to figure out how I can get some grappling hooks and lower myself down a little bit at a time. But we just lost
I
actually
know, I know.
our
Do you want to
sun's
go and fix
coming
it?
out here. We're
Okay.
going to talk through this. Yeah. Uh,
Okay.
so basically, I went the straight route. I went to college in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, a little small liberal arts college called Dickinson College. I was the first person that I know of from the college to go to graduate school in psychology. I was waitlisted. I was the last person in on my class and ended up leaving at the top of my class, which I'm really proud of. And
Okay.
I left an internship in Los Angeles and then went to move to Springfield, Massachusetts, where I've been. I was going there for 1 year, and that was 45 years ago. So you never know how things are going to go. But I got interested in brain and behavior relationships, which was really at its infancy back in the 1970s. Traditionally, psychologists worked on emotions. How are you feeling? Oh, that's so
Mhm.
sad. Here's something to help you with your anxiety. Here's some ways of being more assertive. Here's some ways of managing stress. Learned all those things. But what really got me interested was how the brain worked. The problem was there was very little that was known about it at that point. There were certainly some tests that we were able to use. I look back now and I realize the people that I'm seeing now, people that I'm testing, I see about 500 to 600 people with memory disorders every year, in addition to a couple
Mhm.
hundred people with concussions. My advice to Emily, if I'd seen her back then, would have been don't make any big decisions for a couple months.
Yeah.
The idea,
And
I
then
mean,
she decided to
college,
go to
the idea of
university.
medical school is very crazy. That's what I would have told her. It was, but she did it. Uh, Nowadays, I tell people who come in and say, "Oh, I'm 26 and I didn't get it where I wanted to do. I guess I'm never going to be able to do anything." I look at them and say, "No, no, no." Talking to somebody who's married to someone who started medical school at age 43, I said, "There's
Yeah.
lots of time available. Don't limit your outlook. Don't limit your horizons." So I ended up basically starting the first neuropsychology laboratory in Western Massachusetts at the big hospital in town, Bay State Medical Center. Worked there for about 7 years, decided to go into private practice, and really have not looked back. I've been doing this now throughout my career. And I realized when I estimated the other day, I think I may hold the Guinness record for most neuropsychological evaluations by a single practitioner. I've done over 30,000 evaluations. I know our blurb says
Wow.
20. That's not correct. It's really 30,000 over these years. And what's really great about it is that I go in every day and learn something new. And so when
Mhm.
people say, I see all those gray hairs, you still going to be practicing? I say, I don't know what I could do that would be more interesting than this.
Yeah.
There'll always be a part of me that wants to do this.
Question
It's
with those,
challenging and it's fun.
Yeah.
What we do is actually fun.
how did you get into like the whole dementia side of things and realize that this is something that you guys are going to make as a, I guess, a passion project for your work together, and then go into a little bit about how you pitched the book.
Mhm.
Uh,
Let me tell the first part, and then you can talk about the
Yes,
pitch. Because
okay.
absolutely.
I consider this, the word kismet, about how things just happen,
Yes.
and they're sort of, wow, how did that happen? Separately, completely separately, we each were interested in dementia.
Totally.
Now, my interest turned out to be both professional and personal because my mom unfortunately came down with dementia in the about the year 2000. So by the time Emily and I got back together, she was already at that point in assisted
Profoundly
living.
and profoundly demented.
Yeah. So,
Hmm.
but I had already obviously been doing this as a career. She came about it through interest in residency in psychiatry, I think, really.
Actually, it happened because so many of my patients, when I was in South and North Carolina, they'd come into my practice and I was just an internist at that point, but they were presenting with things like crying as they're laughing or talking about using horrible language where this woman had never sworn in her life. She was the mother of a pastor. So they were coming in with very, what I thought were bizarre changes in their
Hmm.
mental status. And I realized that these people were demented and that I had no idea how to treat it.
Wow.
So I had to teach myself, I had to learn. So I
Mhm.
started getting data through Google, which thankfully at that point was actually up, and you
Hmm.
could begin to get information over the network.
Hmm.
And then residency in psychiatry,
Residency in
specialization.
Yeah.
psychiatry, I just really spent my entire residency looking for every single bit of published evidence-based research about everything we knew about every type of dementia, every drug that
Hmm.
was being looked at, every chemical connection, and that's what I spent my entire residency doing. In addition to working with Mitch, getting his memory orientation screening test validated and published, and eventually
Hmm.
into the hands of doctors.
So it was sort of meant to be as far as we could
Yeah.
figure out.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we were
So,
just really,
so
really lucky.
so the idea for the book wasn't really like, oh, we're going to write this book. It was, we were at this event and we seized the
Yeah,
moment, correct?
we had not decided to write a book. Mitch had just decided to give us a little bit of a working vacation and decided since we both needed continuing medical education credits, why don't we go to Harvard's social sciences um, workshop that they have? And it's one where they teach you how to do social media, how to write books, how to write articles as doctors. And we
Mhm.
weren't even thinking it was going to be that big of a thing, but it was like at our favorite hotel in Boston. It was the Fairmont Copley Plaza, and great hotel. We saunter on in there, and there's close to 1,000 doctors from all over the world in their
Wow.
conference room. Overwhelming. It's a well organized program. And part of what they taught us was how to do a 70-second elevator pitch, how to set up Instagram accounts. I mean, all that kind of stuff. But they actually were bringing in editors, um, agents,
Mhm.
publishers, and if you wanted to write a book or find somebody to connect with to write a book, you could go and talk to them on break times. So I was sitting there thinking, why am I taking notes off of this speaker and this slide presentation when in that other room there's all those editors and publishers and agents? And just luckily enough, the guy standing behind the Johns Hopkins desk was a very, very nice person. And Joe Rusco was there. He was their acquisitions editor. And I walked up to him and said, could you be interested in a book on dementia that is completely evidence based? There is no evidence based book on dementia prevention that's ever been published yet. And he said, yes, that's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for this year.
Yeah.
But that was only after Mitch and I sat there in the symposium area and said, we're going to write a book. What are we going to write a book about? And he said dementia prevention. I said, great. Sounds like a good idea to me.
I love
We
that.
had
The
no
whole there's
clue.
no overthinking on that. It was just let's do it because sometimes we can get stalled just on what is the idea, you know? So good for you.
And by the end of the conference, we went back to Joe and said, Joe, you wanted to in fact, why don't you tell that part of it? Because
So we're standing there talking to him, and Emily decides she was in sales for a long time.
for
She's
over
going to
20 years.
so she's going to close them. She's going to close the sale. She says, Joe, what is it going to take at this point for us to get this contract? And he looks at her and says, if I had one with me, I'd have you sign it now. I looked at him and said, I've got a fax machine, Joe.
Yeah.
And then he backed off because he was bluffing. He says, well, you have
Yeah.
to write a chapter and you have to do an outline. And there's a
Yeah.
committee and this and that. But we went home with a hit list of things that we needed to do in the next month and a half.
Yeah.
Now, meanwhile, we're both seeing tons of patients.
Right.
We're both really, really busy. But we have to squeeze in a month and a half reviewing whatever we needed to review that's out there already, writing this chapter, writing an outline in a way that's going to go through the first committee to see if they're even interested in doing this. So that's how it began, and all the way through at various points. We had never written a book before. We had written some journal articles before, which are difficult, but they're really different writing.
Yeah.
And we figured out a method for writing those kinds of articles together. Writing a book with somebody else who you're living with, who you're in love with, is it's sort of a stress test in a way. I wouldn't recommend it for the
Oh
faint
my
of
God.
heart because you get really the words become your babies. And so you have discussions like, no, this is the word I think needs to, no, that's a stupid word. Come on. No, this is a better word. And you go back and forth like that.
Mitch makes it sound much more pleasant than what it really is. It was initially it was a lot of yelling and screaming.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were some like loud, very loud
Intense. Just serious
Yeah.
discussion.
disagreements.
Seriously.
But the
Yeah.
good news is we eventually learned how to negotiate with each other and how to be kind and sensitive while conveying a very critical thought.
Right.
And we learned what each other's strengths were. So now I don't have to be the best at everything in terms of writing. I know I'm a darn good editor and I can be brutal. When he gives me a first good copy, I can really slash and burn. And then when he gets it and follows that and puts his own little tweaks on it and gives it back to me, wow, it's really wonderful. So we have a good way of working this out at this point.
That's good. That's good. And if you really want, I just want to kind of go back to that you thought you could get this contract via fax, but then you realized you called him on his bluff. And then it was like, well, you have to do the outline in the first chapter, which is, I think, for any type of book you want to write, I think that is the process. And then, but just the whole fact that where you said you were both super busy with clients or with patients, and but it's just, I just want to draw out, if you want it bad enough, you'll find the time to do it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And sometimes you've got to really be committed to it. Once you
absolutely.
have a commitment in your gut,
Mhm.
you just got to live it on a daily basis. It's not
Yeah.
one of these things where you can say, "Well, I'll let that go to the weekend." You can't.
There's another piece of it, though, which I'd like to highlight, which is
Yeah.
also related to behavior change for prevented dementia, which
Mhm.
is that when you have a big thing, it's sort of like putting a 3-pound hamburger on the plate in front of you. No matter how hungry you are, no matter how much you want to eat it, you can't eat it in one bite.
Mhm.
So you got to nibble. And one
Yeah.
of the things that we really learned about how to work on this was to start writing segments, pieces, and then start stitching them together. And then going back and reading it and say, oh, I don't like that. Now let me try to redo it in this direction. And there's a lot of approaches, second, third, fourth approaches, and sticking with the process. So, if you want to lose weight, if you want to exercise, if you want to learn a new language, if you want to do any of these kinds of things that require behavior change, there are some real principles of behavior change that also work for writing.
Mhm.
And that nibbling technique is really critical. And sometimes you just write for an hour or two, and you end up erasing it or putting it aside. Later on, coming back to it, say, that one paragraph was worth saving. Let me
Mhm.
save that. I'll use that somewhere else.
Yeah, you don't have
So
to sit down and write a whole chapter or 2 chapters. It's like the paragraph, and then yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So it's actually
And
very nice in that dementia prevention, what we invite people to learn in the last couple of chapters of the book, taking those nibbles out of the first problem that they want to address. Because
yeah.
if they try and do all 10 at the same time, they're going to get overwhelmed. There's just too
Yeah.
much to keep track of. So if they do the dementia prevention checklist and figure out where they're already okay, where their levels are good, where they need some help, pick the one thing that they can focus on
Mhm.
and get moving on that and get that under control so that they're working from a position of strength as they go to their next area that they need to work
Or
on.
and which it can be a bigger roadblock, so start with the smaller roadblocks and stuff. Okay, so let's get into the book. It's I want to get into just the value proposition of the book. Conceptually, just give us a bit of like how it's structured, the value proposition, and then I have some specific questions that I want to ask you about it. So,
okay, well, let me jump in
Oh,
because that
please.
way Emily
mhm.
won't say, Mitch, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, right.
This is a tough question. Give me all the tough questions.
That's because you're good.
The value proposition is that dementia is a real problem. It is a problem which is growing in its impact on society. 6 to 7 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease today.
Mhm.
In addition to that, there are a whole bunch of other types of dementias other than Alzheimer's disease that probably give us a total of about 10 or 11 million people. That would be bad enough, except it's a growing problem because people are getting older, they're living longer, and they're living in better health. So, consequently, other things that would have killed them in the past are not. So, we know that in the next 15 years, there's going to be about a third more of those people running around without being able to think very well. That's going to make a huge drain on our society, both financially, in terms of money, and also in terms of caretaking. That's the
Mhm.
bad news. It's a growing problem, big problem. The good news is 1 out of 2 cases of dementia can be prevented. Right now, our entire focus, not our entire focus, but the large portion of our focus is on trying to find a cure, and in the meantime, taking care of caregivers and people with dementia. So you see lots of stuff about dementia-friendly communities and care groups for, support groups for caregivers. And we're all for that. That's
Restaurants.
really important. Yeah,
I think there's a restaurant in that's being promoted that all the workers have dementia. I'll have
really.
to have you yeah, yeah.
No, I thought it was for people who had dementia to go there because I could see how, a buffet where all the food is laid out so you can just pick exactly. Really, it's an easy thing sometimes for care
Yeah.
for people with
I'm
dementia.
positive it's the people that work there have dementia and
Right.
Wow.
or or Alzheimer's anyway. And
Yeah.
I want to get into the umbrella because I personally was confused about that umbrella. So you just talked about that umbrella, that there's varying aspects of dementia. I used to always think it was Alzheimer's at the top and then everything underneath. I thought dementia came first and then the rest that ultimately leads to death. So talk a little bit about that as well, or
In
expand
fact,
on that a little
Alzheimer's
bit.
disease was thought until a few years ago to only apply to people who became demented before the age of 65. It was a pre-senile form of memory loss. Now, the Alzheimer's Association has done a wonderful job of popularizing this, which is great because it brings it to people's awareness. But it has confused people, and people now
Mhm.
typically think that all dementia is Alzheimer's or that
Yeah.
Alzheimer's is somehow worse dementia than just garden variety dementia. Like, oh, it's not Alzheimer's? Wonderful, it's just dementia. You say,
Mhm.
nah, it's just a different brand. We look at it as brands. It's sort of like Ford,
Mhm.
Chevy,
Right.
Subaru. Those are all brands of automobiles. Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, frontal temporal dementia, dementia due to alcoholism, dementia due to head injury, dementia as part of Parkinson's disease. They're all types of this broader category. And you have to look at the broader category because they're all important. They all share some common features. We talk about all cause dementia. And the fact
Mhm.
that that's the title we're really using is dementia as it applies to all of these. Because
Mhm.
every single one of them you can have a better outcome if you use your head to change your brain.
There you go. Okay, so I've got some questions. So and the first question was, what was the difference? So thank you for answering that. So when do we know we're in decline, or what symptoms should we be concerned about when it comes to dementia?
Emily?
Well, again, with the understanding that this can be different for different people depending on their age and depending on the type of neurodegenerative process that's going on, because that's what dementias really are. They're brain cells that are degenerating and dying over time. And some of these dementias have shorter courses, like 5 and 6 and 8 years. Others of them, like Alzheimer's disease, uh, begin the brain changes 20 years before you actually see the signs.
Mhm.
So some of the earlier signs can be short-term memory loss, not remembering people's names, not remembering where you put things, not remembering what you went into the grocery store for, or coming out with three things instead of the 10 that you went in for. It can be not, in other people, not remembering how to use their television change channel system, or how to get money out of an ATM, or not knowing how to write a check, or forgetting how to make change, or forgetting that they're how to get home if they're walking or driving. In some people, it has been something as simple as on the golf course, not being able to bend down and pick up the ball off the green,
Wow.
which is something I've heard out of a number of patients. One woman, it was she was a very skilled cook, loved to have 30 people over her house, her extended family for Thanksgiving, and she could always get everything on the table at the right time.
Mhm.
Well, this particular Thanksgiving, she couldn't get anything together on the table at the same time. Turkey wasn't done, the potatoes hadn't even gone into the microwave. So her ability to coordinate and plan and multitask was shot.
Mhm.
So those are some of the things that can go wrong.
Word finding
Okay.
is oftentimes the things that people start to be aware of. They go to say a word, they can't find the word. Now, we all have that from time to time, especially if we're
Yeah,
tired. But these are persistent kinds of things that you'll pick up
persistent.
on when you're interviewing that person. For us, though, the symptoms are really a ticket into evaluation. We want to measure just the same way we
Mhm.
talked before. Did I lose weight or gain weight? Step on the scale. Let's get a
Get
more
a
objective
baseline.
measure.
Exactly. Get a baseline. Okay, perfect. And so, as I had mentioned earlier, I did do a quick little poll on my Instagram to get some questions for you. And one person asked, "Is there a cure?" And I thought, God, that's a really good question. I don't even know if I would have even thought of that there was one. But is there a cure?
Unfortunately, no. And that's where most of the energy, I was talking a minute before, there's two areas where most of the money has gone. One is caregivers and support, and the other is research into finding a cure. In fact, you hear things like, well, the first person to ever be cured has been born already. We just don't know who they are. And that may be true. Although I want fewer people that we have to worry about curing.
Hmm.
We want to be able to prevent half the cases so that the cases that remain, we can then focus our energies on in a much more effective way.
Hmm.
Somebody used an analogy that people get saved by being pulled out of a raging river. And it's very hard to do, and lives are lost. But no one's paying attention to upstream how they fell in. We're interested in how they fell in because if
Yeah,
we can keep them from falling in, the job downstream is going to be a whole lot easier.
The other thing to
exactly.
keep in mind is that if there is a suspicion that there's something going on or somebody's worried because they've been having a problem with word finding or remembering people's names, and they get that evaluated and evaluated properly,
Hmm.
which means you've got to look for the reversible causes of cognitive decline. So while we can't cure Alzheimer's and we can't cure vascular dementia and we can't cure Parkinson's or frontotemporal dementia, there are causes of cognitive loss that are every bit as devastating as those diseases I just mentioned, but are due to reversible causes, such as
Hmm.
B12 deficiency, severe iron deficiency, obstructive sleep apnea can cause significant cognitive impairment. But those things can be identified and corrected. If you correct them early enough, you can actually save that brain essentially. A lot of
And
these
that's
conditions are co factors, are comorbid with
mhm,
Alzheimer's dementia. That's why it's so important when somebody is suspected of having dementia that a full workup be done. So you
mhm.
identify what is completely fixable, fix it, and then deal with what can't be fixed.
So what you're saying then is, it is the prevention approach, obviously, but it's if you if you suspect, and I guess, if your parent had it, does that make a difference? Is that hereditary? Is it hereditary?
There are some forms that are, yes.
Okay,
But it
okay.
probably is a much smaller
It's a
percentage
much
than
Then you
you
think,
think, and than most people, probably less than 5%.
right.
But we also can inherit conditions which lead to dementia. So, for
okay,
example, let's go back to sleep apnea, where
yeah,
people are not breathing effectively while they sleep. But we tend to inherit our parents' airways because our jaws are
hmm,
built like theirs and our tongues will sit in the same place. So you can get conditions there. Hypertension tends to run in families. Obesity tends to run in families.
Diabetes, 25% is heritable.
So
yeah,
basically, you're that's what makes it such a complex question. But getting the point that Emily was talking about, I think really deserves restating. It's not just the prevention, but if somebody already has a diagnosis, there's still things that can be chipped away that can stop it from getting worse. And that's where we, in a clinical fashion, really spend a lot of our time is identifying people already having mild to moderate dementia by the time they walk in, but we still work on all of those contributing factors. And
that
five
can
years later, they're much the same as they were when they walked in the door the first time.
You can actually take
Exactly.
a look in the book. There is we put in the book the actual data from a study that we presented at the American Academy of Neurology annual meeting in 2014 in Philadelphia. And that's where we compare the results of how with our treatment protocol compared with a community sample of patients who were not similarly treated. Our patients actually, over the first 6 months, improved their cognition and then stayed at this improved level of cognition for
Stabilized.
the 2-year period that we uh, let that study run. So, to Mitch's point, when you do identify all the existing cofactors, you can stabilize and, in some cases, improve somebody's baseline cognition.
And so, building on that, so you said B12 deficiency, sleep apnea, and what was the third one that you?
Well, there are reversible conditions such as hyperhomocysteine,
Yeah, okay,
an elevation in methylmalonic acid, which is a sensitive test for B12 deficiency,
right.
iron deficiency, um, vitamin D25 OH deficiency, and then there's the modifiable things such as other deficiencies due to alcohol use or alcohol
Okay, so
toxicity.
this is where I'm going with my question. So, on top of that, reversibility, one of the questions that came through my Instagram poll was, can does smoking marijuana have a cause and effect on dementia?
The answer is we don't know yet.
Hmm.
And the answer for me is that based on the science that I've read so far, if you have someone who has a cognitive impairment to start with, marijuana, just like alcohol, will make that cognitive impairment worse. There's no doubt
Okay.
about that. You can take perfectly normal teenagers who have no hereditary disposition towards schizophrenia or depression or other diseases, and 10% of those kids who smoke marijuana in their early and mid teenage years will develop psychosis.
Hmm.
If you have a person who is pregnant and she uses marijuana, whether it's eaten, ingested, or smoked, that child who she produces later on um, is highly likely to have an abnormal central nervous system because the way our brains process marijuana, called the cannabinoid system, has been hijacked by the
Hmm.
marijuana.
Yeah.
From a practical point of view, because this comes up in clinical practice all the time, there's a couple questions you want to ask. First question is how often, how much, and what's the THC content?
Hmm.
Back in the 70s, when a lot of people were exposed to marijuana in
Yeah.
college, the average THC content was 4%, and the brain age was about 20.
Hmm.
Today, we're looking at people who are in their 70s using marijuana products that have anywhere from 18 to 30%
Oh, I know.
THC. So you have a real different kind of impact on how the brain works
Hmm.
and the state of the brain. From a practical point of view, what I say to people is if you want to know how your thinking is going to be off marijuana, do yourself an experiment.
Yeah.
Stop for about a month.
Yeah.
See whether you're still having the same kind of problems. You may be surprised. I've seen a fair number of people who have taken this challenge, come back, they've got better test scores the second time than they did the first time. And the only real change that they've made is they stopped using marijuana to help them sleep or to deal with their pain. If you want to use it
Yeah.
recreationally once in a while, I don't think that's going to have a real impact. That's just me speaking. I don't know if Emily would agree, but that's where I am with it. You would probably
I would not agree with that. And I don't agree with it because what the science has shown us time and time and time again is when people use marijuana and are tested cognitively using the same tests we use all the time to check the cognition in our patients, you can see the impairments in memory, in different kinds of memory, as well as executive function. That's planning, organization, reasoning, judgment, that multitasking ability, getting the food on the
Hmm.
table at the same
Yeah.
time that you're supposed to. Um, And we can see that, and it depends on whether you're taking it as a vape or whether you're just smoking it normally. There's differences in how long those test deficiencies last. So if we
Hmm.
can see that in young people, we see that in
Yeah.
middle-aged to older folks in our practice. I know one of the first things that I will always caution a patient is who has got memory or has got dementia problems now, please, I want you off the alcohol. I want you off the marijuana. I will also help them get off of drugs. Like a lot
Hmm.
of people need to take an opioid
Pain or
because of
something.
pain,
Yeah.
Percocet,
Hmm.
Percodan. Um, a lot of women, particularly, were started on benzodiazepines
Hmm.
in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and later.
As
We're still
treatment for
taking them.
menopause because they thought they were crazy.
Yeah,
So I have,
they're on Ativan, Xanax.
yeah,
Those drugs have gotta get weaned off.
yeah. So I have two more questions for you. One is, why, and this does actually relate to sort of the midlife. So, why do you think we start to forget things in midlife? Like you guys at the beginning of the podcast talked a little bit about, like, I think it was Mitchell that said, sometimes I walk into a room, forget what I was in there for. I mean, the other day I was just jumping on a call and I realized I just blended up a protein shake, and I looked over about an hour later. I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot I did that. But, or you forgot the person's name and they've been your best friend forever, but just a slip of the moment. So why is it that we forget those things?
I think it's because we're beginning to lose some brain cells, number one. And also, there's other conditions which may impact that. And we may have more going on in our lives than we did at a younger age.
Mhm.
We may
And
also be more sensitive to the fact that we're doing it. If you
Mhm.
did that when you were in high school, people would say, oh, she's a little ditzy. You
Yeah,
look at it now and you interpret it as, oh my goodness, I think I'm losing it.
I'm losing my mind. Exactly, exactly. Okay, and so since the book just got published in 23 or April 2023.
Yep.
So pretty fresh, but the book is essentially a collection of very thoughtful research over the years. So since the book, what do you think it there's been some evolution to some of the information in there, or is it really sort of still kind of the same thing that we've known for years?
the good news is that the information that's included in the book is still relevant and contemporary and current. There is nothing that's been published since we acquired all that data and put it in hard copy in 2023 that has reversed anything that we said in the book. So
Okay,
that's still reliable and accurate data. The other important thing is that any new studies that have come out are confirmatory of the information that was released in the book. So
hmm,
not only has the information not been reversed, it continues to be confirmed as
great,
relevant and reliable and accurate. And
great.
lastly, the two new drugs that were approved by the FDA this year for the use in early Alzheimer's disease at mild cognitive impairment stages, um, those drugs have not substantially improved the outcome in terms of actual cognitive ability in these patients. They do no better than the drugs that we've had available for the last 30 years.
Right. Okay, that's very good. Well, it's a love story turned into a purpose-filled life, and I love it. So thank you so much. You've been a real joy to interview. I probably could sit and talk to you for a few more hours. It's just such an interesting topic. At first, when I got asked to, your publicist reached out, and I thought, oh, do I really? Yes, and I was so happy that I did, because, or that she reached out to me, because it is a very interesting topic and something that I learned so much from listening to you both. So, and I hope that whoever's listening to this podcast has done the same. So, thank you, doctors, for gracing us with your presence, and I hope to have you back soon when you publish your next, or when you get that foundation launched. Let's talk a little bit about that and what the impacts in the world that's going to make. So, thank you so much.
Lynette, thank you. Pleasure being with you.
Great. Thank you.